Hey everybody, for Chapter 4, Lesson 5, what we want to talk about is something a little different than what we've been discussing before. What we want to build on is the differences between the life of an average immigrant and the life of an African American during the Gilded Age, during the Second Industrial Revolution. Remember, we talked briefly the other day about farmers, and I want to extend that conversation so that the farmers we're talking about include African American farmers in the South who did much of the farm work down in the South. And during the Gilded Age, after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, African Americans remained poor. And the reason for that is something called sharecropping. And sharecropping is an interesting thing. The way it works is a farmer has a lot of land, and so then he sells that land, or I should say rather, he rents that land to African American farmers. And those African American farmers, instead of paying rent to the landowner, to the big farmer that owns all of the land, they give him a portion of their crops, so that they only have a small portion left that's their own. The crop is their rent. The problem with that, of course, then, is that they don't have much to sell, right? If I make you give me so much of my crops as rent and you don't have a lot to sell, well, then you can't ever escape poverty and you can't ever go out and buy your own land. And the incredible thing about this, the thing that really kind of blows my mind, is that most sharecroppers, most African American sharecroppers, are working the land of their former slave owner. So instead of having, for example, a whole huge plantation with one master's house and the slave quarters, now we have a house that belongs to this former slave, and that former slave, and that former slave, and that former slave. So that it's the same people working the same land for the same rich white guy, but instead of being slaves, they are stuck on that land because they have to give so much of their crop over as rent that they can't save enough to escape. I think you might be able to imagine why it is that most of those sharecroppers join the People's Party. They join the populist movement, right? Because they want a better life for farmers, a better life for themselves. But the problem is, it's really hard for an African American sharecropper in the South to make a better life for themselves and their family, because the southern states and some of the northern states as well in some places used segregation, or separation of the races by law, to keep African American sharecroppers from gaining too much power. Just like sharecropping kept African Americans from having too much economic power in the South, segregation keeps African American sharecroppers from getting too much political power in the South. So segregation is the actual separation. It's saying by law that white people and African Americans cannot mix. They must be separated. Now, what are the actual laws that do that? What are the laws that say that white people get to ride in the front of the bus, for example, and black people have to ride in the back of the bus? Those laws are called Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow is just a nickname for a white entertainer that used to put on blackface makeup and make fun of African American Southerners. So it becomes a way to point out how stupid African American sharecroppers were, or how stupid whites wished they were. I think that's the better way of saying it. And it's these laws that say, for example, things about buses or bathrooms or water fountains or schools. It's the Jim Crow laws that enforce segregation, that keep the two races separate. Why do we have segregation? Because in 1896, there's a court case. A guy named Homer Plessy, who is in Louisiana, goes out one day and buys a train ticket to the first class carriage of a train. And he buys the ticket, and the train company sells it to him. And the thing is, Homer Plessy's actually black by Louisiana law. He's 1/8 black. He's what Louisiana law calls an octoroon. And an octoroon, by law in Louisiana, was considered fully black. So Homer Plessy, even though he looked white, was by law black. So he gets on the train, he sits in the first class cabin where all the other white passengers, remember his skin tone is very, very light, he looks white. The ticket agent comes along and says, ticket please. And Homer Plessy says, yeah, here's my ticket, and I'm black, I'm an octoroon. And the ticket agent says, you need to move. And Homer Plessy says, you sold me this ticket, you sold me a first class ticket. I'm sitting in first class. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Homer Plessy gets in trouble, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says that Louisiana and any other state can make a black person move to separate facilities as long as the facilities are equal. They look the same, they have the same cushions, the same comforts, the same everything. Separate but equal. In other words, we could make African American kids or Latino kids go to separate schools as long as they got the same textbooks and had the same quality teachers and the same quality desks. As long as everything was the same, we can be separate. That way we're still equal. The problem was, of course, that in southern states all over the South and in many places in the North, it really wasn't equal. African Americans got the worst of whatever was available. So this segregation, thanks to separate but equal, enforced by Jim Crow, helps keep African American sharecroppers poor and out of politics. Another way they kept African American sharecroppers out of politics in the South was by something called a poll tax. And what it was is anytime you wanted to vote, you had to pay a tax before you could vote. The problem was they set this tax at way more than an African American would be able to afford, even if that was just a couple dollars in the late 1800s or early 1900s. Don't forget, when you don't make much money as a sharecropper, that's beyond your reach. That's more than you can actually afford. And it's actually more than some white people can afford, for that matter. Now, African Americans, of course, don't just take this sitting down, obviously. They begin to use the newspapers, education, economic goals, political goals to try and stop segregation, stop the violence, stop discrimination. And there are important leaders at the time, like Ida B. Wells, who crusades against lynching, which is when you hang someone without court approval. She writes a book about it, which people can't believe. There's Mary Church Terrell, who helps found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which is a group that fights against racism and sexism and lynching. And even a guy like Booker T. Washington is going to be out there, and he is going to encourage African Americans to really work hard economically so that white people can't ignore them and have to give them civil rights. Obviously, we're going to do much more with this in class, but I think these are the key points that you'll need to help you understand the situation of African Americans in the Gilded Age, particularly in the rural South.